Hello, my dear friends. The Empire bowed before her, but no one could stand the smell when standing near her. In that splendid palace, people did not smell the scent of flowers, but the smell of old sweat, musty perfume, and unwashed nightgowns. The dirtiest secrets were not in the royal archives, but deep in every layer of dress, every bed, every remaining stain. Tonight, let's lie back and sink into the disgusting hygiene habits of Queen Victoria. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now will you dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one considers the daily habits of Queen Victoria, the most striking detail at the beginning is her unusual fear of water. Bathing was seen by her as an act that could weaken the body, disturb the balance of her health, and even threaten her sense of authority. This was not entirely an invention of her own mind, since in the Victorian era, many people suspected that sudden contact with cold water could bring about chills, fevers, or worse. Still, her refusal was far stronger than that of her subjects. She avoided immersion whenever possible. Instead of using a bath as we would understand it today, she depended on cloths soaked in alcohol. Wine or spirits would be poured over soft towels, and these towels were rubbed across her body to give an impression of cleanliness. The alcohol might have left a cooling sting, and it might have killed a handful of surface bacteria, but it could not replace the function of water and soap. The baths that stood in her rooms were not centres of hygiene, but objects rarely filled with fresh water. When they were used, it was not by following any standard of cleanliness that we would accept. Water was poured in, sometimes used more than once, and only replaced when the colour changed or an odour became undeniable. This practice was closer to maintaining appearances than to maintaining health. To think of it now is unsettling. It is almost laughable that a woman who ruled over an empire believed that sitting in a basin of stale water was a sign of discipline rather than neglect. Yet within the palace walls, her choices became the standard, and no servant was in a position to protest. The staff were instructed to keep cloths and alcohol always at hand. These items were to be prepared daily so that the queen might wipe herself whenever she wished. The scent of spirits clung to her skin, giving the impression that she had just left a tavern rather than a chamber. The smell lingered on her gowns and in the fabric of the furniture. Servants noticed, of course, but none dared comment. To do so would risk accusations of insolence. Silence was the rule, obedience the duty. This silence extended beyond the staff. Courtiers and visiting officials knew nothing of these private routines. They saw the queen in her public role, dressed in silks and jewellery, her image carefully preserved. Behind closed doors, however, the reality was different. The heavy curtains were kept closed to avoid draughts, the windows seldom opened, and the chambers were heavy with air that had not been refreshed. Every fabric absorbed what her body released. The mingling of alcohol, sweat, and unwashed skin created an odour that would have pressed itself onto anyone who entered. If this were to happen today, it would be like a head of state refusing to bathe and instead covering themselves with scented wipes, insisting that the body's natural odour should simply be accepted. The illusion might last in photographs or ceremonies, but not for those who spent time near the person. The idea of bathing as dangerous was tied to Victorian medical uncertainty. Doctors themselves were divided on what caused disease, and ordinary people were left to superstition. Victoria's insistence on avoiding water was an extreme but not isolated version of this. Still, for someone of her power, it set a troubling example. Her personal belief became practice not only for herself, but for those who had to care for her. Servants were required to follow her instructions to the letter, regardless of their own understanding. They carried basins of used water, handled cloths damp with wine, and endured the stale smell of a body only half clean. For them, it was labour without question. The palace was not built to handle such neglect gracefully. Heavy velvet curtains, thick wool carpets, and ornate upholstery trapped every odour. Without fresh air or thorough washing, these surfaces became long-term storage for the Queen's habits. Dust mixed with alcohol fumes, sweat settled into fibres, and the atmosphere grew denser each week. It was a setting meant to project wealth, yet it quietly collected the signs of poor hygiene. I find it unsettling to imagine stepping into a grand chamber hung with gold and velvet, only to be met with the sour smell of unwashed skin masked by spirits. This is not an image of majesty, but of denial. There were some attempts by physicians to persuade her otherwise, but they were brief and ineffectual. The science of the time was too uncertain to provide authority strong enough to overturn the Queen's convictions. A suggestion to bathe more often could be brushed aside as medical fashion. Victoria trusted her own sense of discipline more than the words of her doctors. She believed that avoiding indulgence made her stronger, and to her, bathing was indulgence. Her children and close attendants were inevitably affected by this environment. To live near her was to live with her rules. That meant enduring the smells, following the rituals, and never speaking openly of their doubts. What might have been considered eccentric in another household became unchallengeable in hers. The contradiction between public image and private life was sharp. In public, she was the image of order and strength. In private, she followed practices that belonged more to old fears than to modern science. The resistance to water shaped her life for decades. It was not a passing habit, but a lasting conviction. This makes it one of the defining features of her private existence. When one thinks of Queen Victoria now, one imagines stern portraits, royal ceremonies, and political power. But hidden beneath those images was a woman who considered water an enemy and replaced it with wine-soaked towels. Her fear of water was more than just a personal quirk. It affected the cleanliness of her rooms, the health of those around her, and the comfort of everyone who entered her space. It left behind smells and residues that clung to the palace itself, in a century that prided itself on progress, invention, and empire. This habit stood out as a reminder that superstition and neglect could live even in the heart of power. Hook 3 sentences as required. Victoria's refusal to bathe left her relying on alcohol-soaked cloths and stale water, filling her chambers with odours that never left. Yet what carried those odours most directly were not the curtains or the carpets, but the garments she wore against her own skin each day. Those garments became objects of unease, handled with care and secrecy by the servants who dared not disobey her. The garments worn closest to Queen Victoria's body were among the most private objects in the palace, yet they became a source of discomfort and quiet dread. Her underclothes were thick, heavy layers made to absorb sweat, oils, and menstrual blood, and they were not changed often. These garments were worn for many days in a row, and only when the stains and discoloration became impossible to overlook were they finally removed. Servants could not suggest a change, nor could they act without her direct instruction. The decision belonged to her alone, and her word determined how long each piece would remain in use. This left those who handled the clothing in a difficult position, forced to obey commands that defied the basic standards of cleanliness. The material of the undergarments was strong but coarse. Cotton and linen layers grew stiff with repeated use, clinging to the body as they collected the fluids of daily life. Sweat soaked through during warm days and cold nights alike, leaving dark patches that hardened as they dried. During menstruation, the stains deepened, and the garments became heavy with a mix of fluids. Despite this, the Queen continued wearing them, convinced that frequent changes weakened the body and disrupted its natural rhythms. It is almost absurd to think of the richest woman in the world treating her underwear like an heirloom to be preserved rather than a simple necessity to be cleaned. When a garment was finally removed, The servants had clear instructions. They were to fold it carefully, sometimes air it near a window, and then store it away until told otherwise. Washing was not automatic, and in some cases, the item would simply be dried and reused without proper cleaning. Servants were warned not to hold the fabric too close to their faces, as the smell could overwhelm them. They carried the garments at arm's length, trying not to breathe too deeply. The act of caring for these clothes was not a task anyone wanted, but it was a task none could refuse. The odour was unavoidable. Even when folded and placed in storage, the smell lingered in the air. Cabinets took on the scent of stale sweat and old stains, spreading it slowly into the corners of the room. The longer the garments were left unwashed, the more persistent the smell became. It clung to the fabric of chairs, to curtains, and even to the hands of those who touched it. In a palace full of rich materials, these lingering odours created a quiet tension. They reminded everyone who worked there that beneath the surface of wealth and power was a body left unclean. For the Queen, the reluctance to wash or replace undergarments was linked to a belief in discipline. She saw endurance as a virtue and treated discomfort as proof of strength. If a garment felt stiff or heavy, it was a sign to her that she was resisting weakness, not a reason to change. The servants who suffered the consequences had no such comfort. To them, it was simply dirt and smell, carried day after day until their work demanded they handle it again. If this happened today, it would be like a world leader insisting that the same underwear could be worn for weeks, with aides assigned to fold and air it rather than wash it. The comparison makes clear how strange and humiliating this practice would be in any age. Medical advice was sometimes offered, but the Queen trusted her own habits more than the words of physicians. In her mind, overwashing could cause irritation or weakness, and cleanliness did not mean constant renewal. What appeared to outsiders as neglect was, to her, discipline and restraint. This belief was supported by her authority, which silenced any opposition. Servants knew that questioning her orders would mean dismissal, and dismissal from royal service was a ruin few could risk. So they obeyed, carrying out their duties in silence, even when the work was distasteful. There were, of course, health consequences. Prolonged contact with soiled fabric caused rashes, irritation, and sometimes infections. These were explained away as natural ailments or the unavoidable effects of age. No one could suggest that the habits themselves might be the cause. Silence became the shield that protected her practices, and those who lived with the results had no choice but to endure. I find it unsettling to imagine being one of those servants, forced to fold garments stiff with stains and place them neatly away as if they were fine linens. The thought underlines how power can turn ordinary disgust into an accepted routine. The garments symbolized more than neglect. They reflected the contradictions of her reign. She ruled over a nation that prided itself on progress, yet her personal life resisted the simplest advances in hygiene. She was the figurehead of an empire, but her daily practices would have been considered unacceptable even among the working poor. In this way, the underclothes became an unseen emblem of hypocrisy. They were hidden from public view, but within the palace, they defined the experience of those closest to her. The servants sometimes shared their discomfort in letters or private notes. Descriptions of the smell, the stiffness of fabric, and the reluctance to wash appear in scattered accounts that have survived. These accounts show how the routines of one woman could impose hardship on many others. In a palace where everything glittered with wealth, the most ordinary duty became a burden of odour and stain. It is important to remember that undergarments were not simply fabric in that era. They were considered personal and intimate, linked to modesty and propriety. To handle them without permission was to cross a line, yet in this case, the servants were commanded to do so regularly. The paradox was clear: the items were both sacred and foul, untouchable yet constantly touched. The Queen's will turned them into symbols of control, leaving those beneath her with no voice to object. The undergarments that clung to Victoria's body carried sweat, stains, and odour. yet they were preserved with a care that made no sense outside the palace. They became the silent burden of those who folded and stored them, a duty carried out in obedience rather than reason. But the air of her chambers held more than the smell of fabric, for even the very bed where she slept became heavy with something no servant could ever forget. The private chambers of Queen Victoria were closed spaces, sealed against the outside world. The bed at the centre of her room was large and heavy, surrounded by thick curtains that blocked the flow of air. These curtains were drawn tightly, turning the bed into an enclosed compartment. The belief was that draughts of cold air could bring illness, so windows were rarely opened and air circulation was almost non-existent. Inside such conditions, smells did not escape but lingered. The result was a constant heaviness in the room, a mix of odours that no servant could fully describe, yet none could ignore. The bedding itself was rarely washed. Sheets might be changed after long intervals, but the heavier materials, such as the mattress or the padded cover beneath, were left untouched for months at a time. Sweat soaked into them night after night, and over time, the layers absorbed more than fabric was meant to hold. When a servant approached the bed to straighten it, the smell would rise, catching in the throat and making breathing difficult. It is almost ridiculous that a queen who valued dignity allowed her bed to become something closer to a cellar of damp cloth than a place of rest. Yet this was accepted as normal within the palace, because it was her command. The room was designed with luxury in mind, but the materials of luxury only deepened the problem. Velvet, brocade, and heavy wool clung to odours. The thick drapes and carpets trapped every trace of stale air. Without circulation, the scent grew more pronounced each week. Dust settled over everything, but the real presence was the invisible layer of sweat, oils, and exhaled breath that collected without release. The combination created an atmosphere described by one servant as something that clung to the throat. This description captures the suffocating nature of the space, not just unpleasant, but oppressive. For those who worked inside, it became a duty to endure. Servants could not complain, though they felt the weight of the air each time they entered. They followed the rituals of smoothing sheets, straightening curtains, and sprinkling perfumes at the edges of the bed. But the perfumes only mixed with the odours, masking nothing. The scents of flowers and oils blended with sweat and dust, producing a fragrance that was stranger, not cleaner. If the same conditions were recreated today, it would be like sealing a bedroom with plastic curtains and never washing the sheets, while spraying air freshener each morning as if that solved the problem. From a distance, the room would look rich and cared for, but inside it was another story. Victoria herself accepted this as part of her life. She saw no danger in leaving the bedding untouched, believing that the body's natural strength could overcome discomfort. To her, draughts of fresh air were a greater risk than stale air, so windows stayed closed. She believed in endurance, not indulgence, and thought that changing sheets too often weakened the spirit. What might seem like neglect to us was, to her, discipline. It was another example of how her personal ideas of hygiene overruled both advice and common sense. The servants bore the consequences. They carried out their work with cloths tied at their necks or hands held near their faces. Some recorded in letters that the smell stayed on their clothing long after leaving the room. The odour became part of their lives, lingering on their skin and hair. They accepted it as part of their duty, but privately they were unsettled. I find it disturbing to imagine walking into such a chamber, with curtains closed, air unmoving, and fabric heavy with years of sweat, while being expected to treat it as a place of dignity. The image is less royal than it is suffocating. The problem was not confined to the bed. The whole room absorbed what the bed released. Thick carpets beneath, upholstered chairs nearby, and curtains that stretched from ceiling to floor all carried the same weight of odour. When visitors entered, they may have noticed but said nothing. Etiquette demanded silence. Within the court, the truth about the Queen's bedroom was left unspoken, yet everyone close to her knew. The contradiction was sharp. Britain was seen as a leader of progress, invention, and power, but its ruler lived in chambers that resisted the simplest forms of cleanliness. In public, she was an image of order. In private, her surroundings carried the marks of neglect. The difference between appearance and reality was stark, and yet the system of service, respect, and fear ensured that no change occurred. Reports from those years mention that servants sometimes sprinkled vinegar on rags and placed them near the bed to dull the smell. Others lit candles or burned herbs to shift the air, but these were temporary measures. Nothing removed the core problem, which was that the bed itself and the curtains around it were never given the treatment they needed. The palace continued to function as if all was well. The Queen continued to sleep in the same conditions. The atmosphere in her chambers became part of the unspoken burdens of palace life. It showed how personal habits of one woman could affect the daily lives of many others. Servants learned to breathe shallowly, to stay as brief as possible, and to escape the room as soon as duties were done. For them, it was a reminder that service meant silence even in the face of discomfort. The bed remained a private world, shielded by curtains and unchallenged by advice. Its odours were the secret weight carried by the walls of the palace, a hidden truth behind the grandeur of public ceremonies. It is here that the distance between royal image and private habit is felt most clearly. The heavy air of Victoria's bedroom was not only a matter of physical discomfort, but of symbolic meaning. It represented the persistence of old fears and old practices even as the world moved forward. In the silence of those chambers, the progress of an empire was left outside the door, while inside the Queen clung to routines that belonged more to the past than to the present. Victoria's room, with its thick curtains and untouched bedding, became a chamber of stale air, a place where even the strongest servant struggled to remain. The smell that clung to the throat was a constant presence, a daily reminder of how power could reshape the simplest truths of cleanliness. The Queen saw it as order and protection, but those who entered knew it as suffocation. The sealed room of Victoria was heavy with odours, its curtains and bedding trapping the breath of years. Servants endured it silently, while perfumes and herbs failed to change its nature. Yet beneath the bed and hidden from sight lay something even more unsettling, a vessel of waste that defined her nights more strongly than any curtain or sheet. Beneath the bed of Queen Victoria rested an object that defined the private reality of her nights, a chamber pot without a lid. It was placed directly under the heavy frame of the bed, close enough that she could use it whenever she needed to during the dark hours. The pot was not covered, not emptied during the night, and not treated with any substance to reduce the smell. Each morning, a servant was required to remove it, but until then, its contents remained in the closed air of her bedroom. The odours seeped into the curtains, carpets, and thick fabrics of the room. By the time the sun rose, the smell had already become part of the space, impossible to erase. The chamber pot was porcelain, plain in form, and heavy once filled. Without a lid, it stood open to the air, releasing a constant presence that grew stronger as the hours passed. It was positioned as if it were part of the furniture, accepted as normal within her daily life. The lack of shame or secrecy in this practice was striking. In a household that projected grandeur and formality, the Queen herself allowed her most private waste to rest in the same room where she slept. It is almost darkly humorous to imagine the symbol of an empire sleeping just above a pot of waste that no one dared mention. The servants tasked with removing it followed strict instructions. They were told not to look too closely, not to breathe deeply, and to carry the pot away with as much silence as possible. It was to be emptied each morning, scrubbed lightly, and returned to its place for the next night. No matter how unpleasant, the task was performed without question. Servants learned to hold their breath, move quickly, and treat the pot as if it were simply another royal object. Their discomfort was irrelevant compared to the duty of obedience. The smell did not vanish when the pot was carried out. By then, it had already penetrated the thick velvet curtains, seeped into the carpets, and clung to the walls. Candles, incense, and perfumes were used to soften it, but none of these methods worked fully. Instead, the scents layered on top of one another, producing a heavy atmosphere that was neither fresh nor pleasant. Visitors might not have been able to identify the source, but they felt the heaviness in the air. If such a practice existed today, it would be like a world leader keeping an open toilet under their bed and asking staff to ignore the smell until morning. The idea is difficult to accept, yet in the palace it was simply routine. For Victoria, the convenience outweighed any consideration of cleanliness. She disliked the idea of walking through cold halls to a lavatory at night, and she distrusted the new flushing toilets that were being introduced. She claimed the sound of rushing water disturbed dignity and order. So the pot remained her preferred choice, an object of daily necessity that carried with it the weight of neglect. To her, it was practical. To everyone else, it was something they endured in silence. The servants' experiences were captured in occasional writings, though not in official records. One noted that lifting the pot was like carrying a piece of the night itself, heavy and unavoidable. Another wrote that the smell lingered on their hands no matter how hard they washed. These testimonies reveal the burden that came with proximity to the Queen. It was not just labour, but the acceptance of conditions that would have been unthinkable elsewhere. I find it unsettling to imagine being in that position, told not to breathe while carrying waste that had soaked into carpets worth fortunes. The clash between wealth and reality could not have been sharper. The chamber pot became part of the identity of her bedroom, where it represented more than convenience. It showed how personal beliefs and fears overruled new technologies. While others in Britain slowly accepted modern sanitation, she resisted. Her rejection of toilets was both symbolic and practical. Symbolic, because it showed her distrust of change. Practical, because it left her servants with a daily task of handling waste in a way that spread odour throughout the palace. The presence of the pot affected the wider environment. Carpets beneath the bed became saturated with the smell over time. No amount of cleaning could fully remove it. The air in the room never felt fresh, even after the windows were briefly opened. The heaviness of the odour became part of palace life, endured by those who entered and ignored by those who ruled. It was another example of how power insulated the Queen from consequences while leaving others to cope. The contradiction remained visible in the details of her reign. She was a figure who stood for order, discipline, and moral strength. Yet her own bedroom revealed a private world of neglect. The open pot beneath the bed symbolised the difference between the public image of progress and the private acceptance of filth. Britain advanced in industry, science, and empire, but its Queen clung to a practice that belonged to an earlier time. The contrast was stark, and it shaped the daily experiences of all who served her. The pot was carried out each morning, emptied, and returned. The cycle repeated every day, unchanged for years. It became a rhythm of palace life, a small act that revealed a larger truth. The smell never truly left. The servants never complained openly. The Queen never changed her mind. Victoria's chamber pot stood beneath her bed night after night, an object without a cover that filled her rooms with odour and her servants with dread. It defined the hidden reality of her chambers, reminding all who entered that power could excuse even the most unpleasant routines. Yet beyond the bed and its hidden pot, her habits extended further, touching the very way she cared for her body from head to toe. And when it came to her hair, the practices she followed carried their own mixture of strangeness and discomfort. Queen Victoria's hair was one of her most visible features in portraits and public ceremonies, but the way she cared for it in private revealed practices far removed from the polished image. She disliked the use of soaps and shampoos, fearing that these products would damage her scalp and cause her hair to thin. Instead, she relied on a mixture of eggs, sheep fat, and dark beer. These ingredients were common in older household remedies, but in her case, they became a long-term substitute for any modern method of cleaning. The mixture was poured into her hair, rubbed in, and then left to sit before being rinsed lightly with water or wiped away with cloths. Rather than leaving her hair fresh, the result was often heavy, greasy, and faintly sour with the smell of fermentation. The frequency of this washing was low. She had her hair treated in this way about once a month, sometimes even less often. Between treatments, the oils and residues built up, making her hair cling together in strands that stuck against her scalp. The smell was noticeable to those who worked near her, a faint odour of yeast and old fat that could not be ignored. It is almost comical to imagine a ruler of an empire appearing in portraits with hair that had been steeped in beer and animal fat, then combed through as if that were a mark of elegance. Yet in the palace, this routine was accepted without question. The tools she used for grooming reflected the same neglect. Her combs and brushes were made of silver, ornate and expensive, but they were never properly cleaned. They were only wiped with dirty cloths after use, leaving behind traces of oil and residue. Over time, these tools became darkened and sticky, holding the smell of the substances applied to her hair. Servants handled them carefully, as they were valuable objects, but they carried with them the evidence of long neglect. The smell of her hair filled her bedroom when it was being treated. The mixture of egg yolk and beer released a sour odour that clung to fabrics and curtains. The fat left greasy marks on linens and towels, making them difficult to reuse. After each session, the servants aired out the room as best they could, but with windows rarely opened, the air remained heavy. Perfumes were sprinkled on her hair and sprayed in the room, but this only added another layer of scent without removing the original one. If this routine existed today, it would be like someone insisting on washing their hair with butter and stale beer once a month, then brushing it with tools that had never seen soap. The comparison shows clearly how strange this practice would appear in any modern setting. For Victoria, these methods were not acts of neglect but of care. She believed that avoiding harsh soaps preserved her natural strength and that traditional remedies kept her hair thick. She trusted old habits more than new products. The greasy texture and lingering odour were signs, to her, that the treatment was working. Servants might have seen it differently, but they had no choice except to follow the process she demanded. The appearance of her hair in public was managed carefully, styled into tight arrangements, covered with veils, or set under crowns. The grease and odour were hidden from view. What the public saw was a queen with orderly hair, a symbol of discipline. What the servants saw was something else entirely, a head of hair coated with substances that clung and soured over time. The contradiction between image and reality was sharp, and once again it was the staff who bore the discomfort. I find it disturbing to imagine standing behind her chair, brushing through strands that stuck together with fat, while knowing that the brush itself had not been washed in months. The task would have been more unpleasant than ceremonial. Her resistance to shampoo and modern cleaning agents was another example of how personal conviction outweighed advice. As newer products became available in the 19th century, some doctors and reformers promoted them as healthier alternatives, but the Queen dismissed such advice, preferring what she believed to be safer and more natural. To her, animal fat and beer were reliable, familiar, and proven. To others, they were reminders of old habits that refused to fade. The consequences of these routines extended beyond odour. Build-up on the scalp could cause irritation, dandruff, and infection. Yet these problems were explained away as minor inconveniences or as natural effects of age. No one suggested that her methods might be the cause. The Queen's word overruled observation, and her habits continued unchanged. Servants adapted by enduring the smell, keeping their distance when possible, and cleaning up the mess left behind. The hair rituals fit into a larger pattern of her life. They showed the same mistrust of water, the same resistance to new technologies, and the same belief in discipline through discomfort. Just as she avoided bathing, she avoided soap for her hair. Just as she slept above an open chamber pot, she wore her hair with the residue of beer and grease. The habits were consistent, and together they shaped the environment of the palace. For the servants, these rituals were a burden of silence. They carried bowls of beer and fat, applied them to her scalp, and combed through the strands that clung together. They then carried away towels and cloths soaked with grease, knowing the smell would linger on their hands. This was their daily reality, hidden from the public eye, but unforgettable to those who lived it. Victoria's hair treatments left her with greasy strands, sour smells, and tools that never saw proper cleaning. To her, it was strength and tradition. To those around her, it was another form of neglect wrapped in authority. The truth of her hair care practices reveals how power could transform private habits into unquestionable law. Her hair, coated in fat and beer, carried the odour of old remedies and the weight of neglect. Servants brushed and styled it into order, but beneath the crowns and veils, the reality remained. And if her hair seemed unpleasant, the way she treated her mouth revealed something even more troubling, for even her teeth were never cleaned in the way we might expect. The way Queen Victoria cared for her teeth was as unusual as her other habits. She disliked toothbrushes, believing that the bristles could loosen her teeth and cause them to fall out. This fear was common enough in her time, when dental care was poorly understood, but she took it further than most. Instead of brushing, she wiped her teeth with cloths dipped in strong alcohol. Brandy or whiskey was applied to the cloth, and she rubbed it lightly across her front teeth, avoiding anything that might scrape or press too hard. The ritual gave her a sense of cleanliness without actually cleaning anything. Food particles, stains, and bacteria were left untouched in the gaps. The result was an illusion of care that hid decay beneath the surface. The smell of her breath was a constant presence. The alcohol did not remove odour but added to it, mixing with the remains of food lodged between her teeth. In the mornings, her breath carried the scent of iron, alcohol, and spoiled meat. Servants and close attendants who had to stand near her noticed it, though none spoke openly. They endured it in silence, holding their breath when necessary, and waiting until they could step away. It is almost ironic that a queen surrounded by perfumes and fine silks carried a mouth that smelled more like a tavern than a palace. The cloths she used for wiping were often the same ones kept near her bedside or dressing table. They were not always washed between uses, only wrung out and left to dry. Over time, they stiffened with alcohol and residue. This meant that the very tool meant to clean her teeth was itself unclean. When she pressed it to her mouth, she spread old stains and bacteria rather than removing them. The belief that alcohol itself was enough to kill germs kept her convinced that she was protected. Though the truth was otherwise, her diet only made the problem worse. Heavy meats, rich sauces, and sweet puddings clung to her teeth. Without brushing, these remains hardened into deposits along her gums. The alcohol could not remove them, and so they built up over time. This caused inflammation, bleeding, and pain. But these were explained away as natural effects of age. The true cause, neglect of proper care, was never admitted. If a leader today refused to use a toothbrush and instead dabbed at their teeth with whiskey, it would cause shock and ridicule around the world. In her time, however, the silence of those around her protected her from criticism. Dentists were called to see her from time to time, but their work was limited. They were not permitted to scrape her teeth or probe too deeply. She distrusted their tools, believing that metal instruments could harm her energy and spirit. As a result, they could do little more than examine her from a distance and make polite comments. When pain became too severe, teeth were sometimes pulled, but no real prevention was ever attempted. The Queen avoided anything that felt intrusive, even when it meant allowing decay to spread. Servants who attended her meals were the first to notice the condition of her mouth. Bits of food often stuck between her teeth and remained there until she wiped them with her cloth. The wiping was never thorough. Small particles remained and rotted slowly, adding to the odour of her breath. Sitting near her during meals became a challenge, but no one spoke out. Etiquette demanded silence, and the power of her presence demanded obedience. I find it unsettling to imagine leaning close to serve her, forced to breathe in air heavy with alcohol and rot, while pretending that nothing was wrong. Victoria believed strongly in discipline, and her resistance to toothbrushes was framed as another act of strength. To her, brushing was unnecessary, an indulgence invented by others. She trusted the sting of alcohol as proof of cleanliness, convinced that what burned must also purify. This belief gave her confidence, but it left her mouth in a state that only worsened with time. Servants adapted, dentists were silenced, and the routine continued year after year. The palace adapted as well. Perfumes and scented cloths were kept nearby to disguise the odours that lingered after meals. Rooms were aired more often than usual following her dinners, though without explanation. Guests noticed little because etiquette kept them at a distance. It was those in her closest circle who suffered most, caught between duty and discomfort. Her resistance to brushing fit perfectly with her other habits. Just as she avoided bathing and washing her hair properly, she avoided the toothbrush. Just as her chamber pot was left uncovered, her mouth was left untreated. The pattern was clear, personal conviction was stronger than science, and tradition was stronger than progress. These habits defined her life and shaped the daily routines of those around her. The consequences became visible over the years. Her teeth darkened, chipped, and broke. Some fell out, leaving gaps that changed her speech. Yet even then, she did not embrace proper cleaning. She relied on her clothes and alcohol, believing them to be enough. The truth was plain to those around her, but truth was powerless in the face of royal command. Victoria's refusal to brush left her with a mouth that smelled of alcohol, iron, and old food, disguised only by perfumes and silence. Servants endured it daily, dentists stood helpless, and she remained convinced of her own discipline. To the empire, she was a symbol of strength. To those close to her, she was a woman whose habits betrayed neglect more than majesty. Her teeth, wiped with cloth and alcohol but never brushed, carried the evidence of years of neglect. The smell of her breath spread through her chambers, a presence as strong as any perfume. And if her mouth seemed troubling, the way she handled the simplest of objects, her handkerchiefs, revealed another layer of habits that unsettled those who lived around her. Among the small objects that accompanied Queen Victoria each day, her handkerchiefs stood out not for their beauty but for the way she used them. In most households, it was common to change handkerchiefs daily, especially among the wealthy who could afford an abundance of clean fabric. For her, however, the same piece of cloth might be used repeatedly for a week or more. The handkerchief served many purposes. It was pressed against her face to blot sweat, lifted to her nose when she sniffled, and rubbed along her neck to absorb oil. The fabric collected powder that fell from her skin, dust from her gowns, and stains from whatever it touched. Over time, the cloth grew stiff and discoloured, yet it remained part of her daily routine. These handkerchiefs were made of fine linen or cotton, sometimes trimmed with lace, but their quality did little to reduce the unpleasantness of repeated use. Once dampened with sweat or dust, they were hung over the headboard of her bed or placed on a nearby table to dry. Afterward, they were used again without washing. The result was a piece of cloth that held layer upon layer of residue. It is almost absurd to picture the Queen of the British Empire reusing a handkerchief stiff with sweat and powder, as if fine lace could transform dirt into something acceptable. Servants were instructed not to replace the clothes unless given permission. They might fold them neatly or move them to another location, but they were not to wash them without her command. This meant that the same handkerchief could circulate through her daily life, until the smell became obvious. Even then, replacement was not guaranteed. The Queen had her own sense of timing and order, and her staff followed it without complaint. The smell of these cloths added to the already heavy atmosphere of her chambers. Hung near her bed, they released odours into the air during the night. When she picked them up again in the morning, the dampness returned to her skin. The combination of sweat, powder, and dust made them both unpleasant and unhygienic. Yet to her, they were a sign of practicality, a habit that did not require constant attention. If a modern leader today insisted on using the same handkerchief for an entire week, carrying it from the bedroom to public events, it would be a scandal within hours. In her time, silence made it invisible to all but her closest attendants. For the servants, handling these cloths was another task added to their burden. They folded them, aired them, and placed them back within reach. The smell clung to their hands, especially when the cloths had been heavily used. Some servants noted privately that the stains and stiffness made the fabric unpleasant to touch. Still, obedience was required. Complaints could mean dismissal, and so silence prevailed. I find it disturbing to imagine lifting a handkerchief stained with sweat and pressed repeatedly against a face, only to fold it carefully as if it were a prized possession. This image captures the contradiction between royal wealth and private neglect. The presence of these clothes reflected more than personal choice. They showed how even the simplest standards of cleanliness could be ignored when reinforced by authority. A handkerchief is a small item, but in its repeated use, it became a symbol of the wider habits of the Queen. Her reluctance to replace or wash them paralleled her avoidance of bathing, hair washing, and dental care. It was part of a consistent pattern, one in which comfort and belief outweighed hygiene and science. The clothes also carried practical risks. Repeated contact with skin, especially when damp, could spread irritation and infection. Bacteria grew in the folds, and each reuse pressed them back against her face and neck. This might have contributed to the skin problems she sometimes suffered, though these were explained away as minor ailments. The connection between dirty handkerchiefs and skin irritation was never admitted. The Queen trusted her routines, and those around her had no voice to argue otherwise. In the wider culture of the 19th century, handkerchiefs carried symbolic meaning. They were seen as marks of refinement, often embroidered and displayed as tokens of status. For Victoria, however, their symbolic value clashed with their practical neglect. What should have been an emblem of dignity became another example of habits that contradicted her public image. Guests who saw her with lace-trimmed cloths assumed elegance, never realizing how long those cloths had been in use. The persistence of this routine again highlights the divide between public and private life. In public, she was the face of order, morality, and progress. In private, she was a woman who reused handkerchiefs until they were stiff with residue. The difference was hidden by silence, etiquette, and obedience. No one outside her chambers was allowed to know, and those inside had no power to speak. The handkerchiefs of Queen Victoria were more than cloth. They were daily objects that absorbed the residue of her life and released it into her chambers. They stood as quiet symbols of neglect, tolerated because of who she was, endured because of what she represented. Her handkerchiefs, reused day after day, absorbed sweat, powder, and odour, turning from fabric into carriers of neglect. Servants folded and replaced them without question, while the air of her chambers grew heavier with their presence, and while these cloths unsettled those who handled them. Another habit within the palace caused even greater unease, one that involved not the Queen herself, but the servants who tried to remain clean in her service. The servants who lived and worked inside the palace were bound by the habits of Queen Victoria, just as much as by her authority. Their daily routines were shaped not only by duty, but also by the personal beliefs of the Queen herself. One of the clearest examples of this came when a young maid was dismissed from service because she bathed too often. She had made it her practice to wash herself each morning, a habit that might seem ordinary or even admirable. Instead, it was judged offensive. The Queen complained that the maid carried the smell of soap wherever she went, and that such a smell was unpleasant and unnecessary. For Victoria, the natural scent of the body was to be valued, while the manufactured fragrance of soap was considered intrusive. This belief turned the normal expectations of cleanliness upside down. Where most households, especially among the wealthy, encouraged frequent washing as a sign of refinement. In Victoria's palace, the opposite was true. Cleanliness beyond what the Queen practiced herself was unwelcome. To bathe too often was to risk criticism, even punishment. It is almost laughable to think of a palace filled with wealth, where a servant could lose her livelihood simply for smelling of soap. Yet this was the reality of life inside her household. The dismissal of the maid was not a minor event. It became a warning to others. Servants quickly learned that moderation in washing was essential if they wanted to keep their positions. Bathing too frequently might mark them as disobedient or disrespectful. In effect, the Queen's personal habits became the law for everyone who lived near her. Servants avoided soap and water more than they might have otherwise, fearful of attracting attention for the wrong reasons. The belief that natural odours were noble extended to the wider environment of the palace. Victoria held that the smell of the body, unmasked by soaps and perfumes, represented authenticity. She disliked artificial scents, except when used sparingly to mask unavoidable odours in her chambers. For her, the body's own presence was a sign of honesty. To servants, however, it was a demand to suppress their own standards of comfort. They were forced to carry the Queen's definition of cleanliness into their own lives. The consequences were clear. A palace already heavy with stale air and unwashed fabrics became even less tolerable when those who worked within it avoided soap. The smell of sweat and labour clung to uniforms, aprons, and skin. The effort to keep the Queen satisfied created an environment where natural odours accumulated, making the space oppressive. If a workplace today demanded that employees avoid soap and punished them for smelling clean, it would cause outrage and legal battles within days. In the 19th century, within the Queen's palace, it was accepted in silence. For the servants themselves, the dismissal of the maid was both frightening and humiliating. They saw a colleague punished for a habit that many of them secretly wished they could practice. Daily washing was rare among the poor, not by choice, but by necessity. To find themselves in a palace and forbidden to improve their own habits felt like a cruel irony. Instead of offering better conditions, royal service often meant surrendering the few comforts they might have gained. I find it disturbing to imagine being in that position, knowing that a simple act of bathing could be judged an offence strong enough to end a career. The power of one woman's preference outweighed reason, comfort, and health. This dismissal also reflected the tension between modern change and old beliefs. The 19th century was a period of rapid innovation, including advances in sanitation. Public health reformers promoted washing as essential to preventing disease. Yet at the very centre of the empire, the Queen herself rejected these ideas. Her influence extended far beyond her own household, shaping attitudes toward cleanliness among those who looked to her as a model. The irony was stark as Britain prided itself on progress. Its monarch clung to a vision of the past. The culture of fear that grew in her palace reinforced obedience. Servants no longer saw bathing as a personal choice. It became a risk. They avoided water, limited their use of soap, and followed routines that mirrored the Queen's habits. What might have been personal preference in another home became a strict order in hers. The dismissal of one maid ensured that the rest would fall in line. The palace itself bore the signs of this policy. Corridors and chambers carried the weight of natural odours that were never fully masked. Clothing grew musty more quickly. The air remained thick and unrefreshed, yet no one raised the issue openly. To speak against the Queen's habits was to challenge her authority, something no servant could afford. Silence again proved stronger than truth. The maid who was dismissed disappeared from the records of the palace. Her story survived only in the accounts of others who remembered what had happened. She became a symbol of the limits placed on those who served. Her fate warned everyone that even the smallest details of hygiene could be judged unacceptable. From that point on, the message was clear: the Queen's beliefs came first, and comfort or health came second. Victoria's rejection of soap and her punishment of those who used it created a palace where personal cleanliness was restricted. Servants endured, adapted, and suppressed their own instincts. The Queen's view that natural odours were noble became the guiding rule, shaping not only her life but the lives of everyone around her. A maid dismissed for smelling of soap revealed how power reshaped the meaning of cleanliness inside the palace. Her loss became a silent lesson to others, reinforcing neglect as discipline and natural odours as noble. But beyond the servants and their struggles, Victoria's own habits grew even more unsettling when considered during her private times of the month, when her body demanded care that she refused to give. The most private aspects of Queen Victoria's life were governed by the same habits of neglect that marked her daily routines. During her monthly cycle, she did not adopt methods of care that might have limited odour or improved comfort. Instead, she relied on thick cloths folded and pressed against her body to absorb the flow. These clothes were not replaced frequently. They were often worn for an entire day or more before being changed, and the result was an accumulation of blood and sweat that left the fabric heavy and odorous. Only at the end of her cycle were the cloths collected, washed, and reused. Until then, they were hung to dry in private rooms, releasing smells that spread quietly into the surrounding air. The Queen treated this as entirely normal. To her, frequent washing or changing was unnecessary and even wasteful. She saw no reason to disturb the body's natural rhythm with what she considered excess. Yet the consequences of this routine were difficult to ignore. The sheets of her bed grew stained and heavy with odour. The mattress beneath, rarely if ever cleaned, absorbed these odours and held them for months. Servants tasked with changing the bedding noticed the smell immediately. It is almost comical that a palace decorated with gold and jewels contained a bed that smelled less like royalty and more like a neglected sick room. The clothes themselves were coarse and difficult to clean once stained. Boiling or scrubbing left them stiff, but they were still reused. When hung to dry in her chambers, they released a sour metallic odour that clung to curtains and carpets. Servants who handled them were instructed not to comment, though many found the task deeply unpleasant. Carrying the clothes meant carrying the smell, which sometimes followed them long after they left her rooms. They bore this duty in silence, as refusal or complaint would have been treated as disobedience. The presence of these cloths in her private rooms shaped the atmosphere. Combined with unwashed sheets and closed windows, the odour became difficult to disguise. Perfumes were used to mask it, but these only added another layer to the heavy air. Guests who visited never entered such private areas, so they remained unaware. The Queen herself accepted the condition as part of life. To her, it was a natural process requiring no more attention than the occasional drying of cloth. If such practices existed today, it would be like someone refusing all modern sanitary products and instead leaving stained fabric to dry in their bedroom for days at a time. The image makes clear how far her habits were from anything we would consider normal. For the servants, this part of their work was perhaps the most difficult. They were not only required to handle stained cloths, but also to clean the bed after the cycle ended. The sheets were washed infrequently, the mattress never. They carried away linens that smelled strongly of blood and sweat, knowing that much of the odour would remain in the bedding beneath. These tasks, performed without acknowledgement or reward, reminded them daily that royal service meant accepting what could not be spoken. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine standing in such a room, with stained cloths hanging to dry and a bed heavy with odour, while being required to treat it all as ordinary. The health risks of these habits were real. Prolonged contact with unwashed cloths could cause infection and irritation. The combination of sweat and bacteria made the risk higher, yet this was not recognised. Medical advice at the time offered little improvement, and the Queen's personal resistance to frequent washing meant that reform was impossible. She trusted her own judgment more than the suggestions of doctors, and so the habits continued unchanged. The palace, heavy with rich fabrics and thick carpets, became a trap for these odours. Unlike stone or wood, fabric absorbed and held the smells of her routines. Curtains hanging near her bed, carpets underfoot, and upholstery in her private rooms all carried traces of her cycle. This created a background odour that servants knew well but outsiders rarely encountered. The contrast between the opulence of the palace and the reality of its smells was another reminder of the gulf between image and truth. The Queen's reliance on cloth rather than more frequent changes reflected her belief in endurance. She saw discomfort as a test of strength. Just as she avoided water and toothbrushes, she avoided what she saw as indulgence in this most private area. To her, discipline meant resisting comfort, even if that comfort meant health and cleanliness. The paradox was that her insistence on discipline created conditions of neglect. For those who worked near her, this discipline meant long days in heavy air. They followed orders, carried cloths, and endured the atmosphere. They had no power to alter the routines. Their silence allowed the habits to persist, just as it had with every other aspect of her hygiene. Victoria's cycles, managed with cloths that were seldom changed and seldom washed, left behind odours that clung to her bed, her chambers,